How's it? Sure, I'm buggered, eh? Ready for the weekend. What I need is some tea and some R&R. So I've already poured my tea. I'll let that steep. And in the meantime, we'll get into chapter 14. America. My first fishing experience in America was quite successful, but with a sting in the tail. By now, Dad had convinced me that a life in the bush would never pay enough to live on. So why not take up dentistry? Then I could work 1 day a week and spend the rest of the time in the bush doing whatever I wanted. It sounded like a good idea, so I never did understand why he was so surprised when I did as he suggested. He suggested I go to La Sierra College in Southern California so that I could be close to where he was working at Loma Linda University. This I did, and luckily I had no transcripts of past schooling, which showed all the classes I failed in the past. So they let me start college with a maximum of 14 hours credit. Work was of the utmost importance, as I was paying my own way through school. There was a farmer 2 miles from the school, and his cows used to graze right up to the fence of the school. I called the farmer, getting his number from information. He wanted to meet me at 2 o'clock that same afternoon. I went and put on a white shirt, long pants, and black shoes. I wanted to make a good impression, because this was what I had always heard others saying. As I left the dorm, I realized I was late to walk that distance and had to find a fast way to get to the farmer's office. I saw the cows grazing against the fence and decided to do what I always did in Tanganyika as a boy to get to a village in a hurry. I would grab the cow's tail, and if you managed to hang on, the cow would always bolt for home. This I did, and was soon taking 20-foot steps across the field all the way to the barn, which was only a bit from the office. It was an exhilarating run, and I felt quite proud of the fact that I got there on time. Walking into the office, I was greeted by the farmer, who looked me up and down. "Like cows, do you?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I've worked with them before." I didn't mention that I was quite good at riding them like horses. "Well, looks like you're dressed for work, so you might as well start now. You know how to drive a tractor?" "Yes, sir." I had never driven one, but I figured it must be like a Land Rover. "Right, you go out and speak to Gomez over there at the chicken shed, and he'll tell you what to do. And whatever you do, when you drive the spreader, drive in first gear." He seemed quite firm about that. "Yes, sir," I replied, and walked out to find Gomez. Back in the sun, I looked down and saw what the farmer was talking about when he said I was looking ready for work. In running through the pasture, I had stepped in a lot of fresh cow pies, and my clothes were covered. I rubbed my face, and sure enough, there were even flecks of it on my face. No wonder he thought I liked cows. Yeah, I was going to get my tea going. Cheers. That's the stuff. Just what the doctor ordered at the end of a long day, at the end of a long week. Alright, so he's going out to find Gomez. I enjoyed the lilt to the way Gomez spoke. He was a quiet man and chatted with me for a while, finding out where I was from, and telling me, "Man, you talk real funny." He also thought it was funny when I asked him what tribe he was. Gomez introduced me to the huge tractor I was to drive. "Does it have a name?" I asked. At home, all our modes of transport had names. "No, man, it's just a tractor. It's just a tractor." Gomez sat high up on the high seat, and I climbed up next to him. All the gears were shown on a diagram. All I was shown was how to start it and shut it off. It was explained to me how the whole program worked. Gomez was the manager who oversaw everything. He used a skip loader, a tractor with a scoop on the front, to load all the chicken manure into a large dump trailer, which was pulled by my tractor. I would haul it out to a spot next to a field and dump it where another skip loader would scoop it up and put it in the sunshine wagon, which was the manure spreader. This would then proceed at a snail's pace across the fields, spreading all the chicken manure. I was so excited to be driving my first tractor. Gomez was very proud of me because I was back in half the time the others took. That same afternoon, I asked Gomez if I could load the tractor with the skip loader, and then he would not have to leave his chickens alone. He agreed, and it didn't take me long to load up the trailer and haul it away. It wasn't long before I was driving everything along the whole chain from the beginning to the end. Gomez realized that there were too many people on the job and had them do something else, and I was left in charge of getting the manure onto the fields. This was fine for the first 2 weeks, and then for some reason the boss came and told me that I had to finish this one field by that afternoon. Driving the sunshine wagon in first gear was all right if there were no deadlines to meet, but I would never get it done in time at this rate. I put it into second gear and was satisfied that the cloud behind the truck had doubled in size. The third load, I got it into third gear, and the cloud behind the truck was now quite impressive. I hauled the loads back as fast as I could, and figured that I was doing so well, I might as well go the whole hog, and put it into fourth. The cloud behind the truck was now about 30 feet into the air. Then I heard a metallic clunk, and the cloud disappeared immediately. I stopped the truck, noticing a hole in front of me, so I figured I would back up and then drive to the chicken house and have Gomez help me fix the spreader. However, due to months of manure collecting on the windows, there was no way of seeing behind me, and I backed up blind, right into the boss who had pulled up behind me in his new pickup. He was not a happy man. He hopped up and down for a while, shouting a lot, and finally told me I had to go and take a pitchfork and clean out the troughs at the cattle shed. I had a lot of time to think on the way back to the shed. I first went and told Gomez what had happened. He was very sympathetic. He kept shaking his head and saying, "Deep shit, man, deep shit." I had never held a pitchfork, but had held something similar. We used to spear catfish in the rivers with a spear with 3 heads. The only difference was that these forks had their spears in a row. They were not very good for cleaning out troughs, but I kept at it for a while until I went to this water tank for a drink. In the tank were some big fish. Being about tea time, I took my pitchfork and speared 2 of them, scaled them, degutted them, and put them over a small fire I had made. While they were roasting nicely, the boss came to see how I was doing. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at my fire. "I just speared a couple of fish for my tea, sir, and I'm cooking them." I kept poking the rubbish out of the trough. "You did what?" he shouted. I stopped working, and pointing to the water tank, I said, "I speared 2 fish out of that tank when I was having a drink, and I'm eating them for tea, sir." For the second time that day, he started to hop up and down. He was shouting something about Japanese carp and $5,000 and savage from Africa. Gomez came running. His hand went over his mouth, and he was shaking his head again. My boss's final words to me, "You're fired, and don't you ever pull my cow's tail again. Get away from here! I was expelled from La Sierra College. I had started to collect snakes again. I had started to collect animals again. I also had snakes. Next to my bed was a gaudy, gold-colored plaster of Paris pot, covered in figurines of naked ladies that someone had bought in Tijuana and then thrown away. I thought it a great house for my pet bull snake, one of many, and he liked it in there. He was quite protective about his territory too, and when I reached in there to get a magazine, I always had to do it slowly. The housemaster of the dormitory I was in was a curious fellow, always looking for contraband that might get us into trouble. I was in biology class when this Mr. Shreve, the housemaster, came running in with his finger bleeding. Behind him was one of the prefects with my dead bull snake. I recognized him right away because he had lost the end of his tail at some stage in his life. I leapt up from my seat, taking possession of my snake and spitting some words at the prefect. Mr. Shreve was asking the biology teacher if it was poisonous. I replied, any dickhead could see that it wasn't poisonous. And the rest goes unsaid. I was on my way to another school. Pacific Union College is located in a small village called Angwin, up on a mountain range. It was a school mainly for farmers' kids, and so I fitted right in. My first job was with Dr. Andron, who was a psychiatrist. He had a beautiful home down on Ink Grade, and my job was to build a reflecting pool with a fountain. I had done major landscaping jobs with Mom at every place we had ever lived, so this was fun to me. Having been given a free hand on the design, I made it in the same shape as Lake Lutoto in Uganda. I built the fountain up against the old stone boundary, using large limestone rocks that were covered with moss. I concreted these same limestone rocks all around the edge of the pond, and then made a floor of concrete using an additive to make it waterproof. All the time I was working, I sang. No one was around, so sometimes I sang loudly. Not having a particularly beautiful voice, Mrs. Andron would come out sometimes and ask me to turn it down a bit. On the day I finished the reflecting pool, I was in the process of filling it with water when a 10-year-old boy came out and started to ask a myriad of questions. He even started to ask about the scars on my legs and foot, of which there were many. I asked him if he liked snakes. He assured me he didn't. I told him how lovely and beautiful they were, and that he should try petting one that I kept behind a pile of rocks. I went over to the pile and took a piece of rubber hose as he was already beating a hasty retreat, I had to run to catch up. I knew how I'd overdone it the moment he started to scream. I went back to the reflecting pool, where Jim Clifton was trimming a huge oak tree. He had a small homelight chainsaw attached to his belt, and was cutting out all the dead wood, trimming out the center branches, and giving the tree a bit of shape, he informed me. I was standing there when Dr. Andron arrived. He was not happy. I wanted to suggest a good psychiatrist that could give him some counseling, but I didn't have time. In his hand was a check, and he said the two words I knew were coming. "You're fired." "What did you do?" "What did you do?" asked Jim from the top of the oak tree, as soon as the doctor had left. "I frightened the son of one of the patients." I explained what the screaming had been about, and Jim almost fell out of the tree laughing. I helped him finish off the tree, and then he had me help him on his next job. We went to George von Garden's apple farm and trimmed a large oak tree right next to his house. It happened to be the biggest oak in the country, and all the tree boffins used to come and see it, measure its girth, and speculate on how tall it was. We did a bit more than they did. We climbed it and trimmed about 10 tons of wood off, letting the pieces down on a rope so that it wouldn't make a hole in the roof. George himself took a lawn chair and put it next to a huge camellia bush and watched us all afternoon. He kept asking if my feet were cold, as it was winter time and I was still barefoot. I always found it easier to climb a tree without shoes, and as I was also running back and forth across the roof, I felt safer being barefoot. This was my introduction to George, and when Jim told him I had just been fired and I didn't have a job, his reply was, "Well, you've got one now. Whenever you have time, come down here." My first question was, "What's the pay, sir?" "Don't worry about the pay, just come." "What would you like me to do for you, sir?" "Just do what needs doing, and don't call me sir. It is George." It was a strange arrangement, but it was the only job in my entire life from which I was not fired. His farm was 4 miles from the school, and after classes every day, I would run the 4 miles to George's farm. It was 40 acres of pine and apple trees. It had a good-sized dam with swans, mallards, calls, and mandarin ducks. My first afternoon I arrived, and George was having a nap, so I got stuck into his garden. It was full of the largest camellias I had ever seen, and many azalea bushes. Someone who measured everything with a ruler, not stopping to think that nothing in nature is straight, and that small bushes needed light, had planted everything. I had transplanted a couple of azaleas by the time George got up. He had been standing behind me for some time, and as I was so absorbed in what I was doing, I didn't even notice him. "I've been wanting to do that for a long time." I jumped, spinning around, and there he stood with his thick glasses that made his eyes 4 times bigger than they actually were. "Come, to the kitchen now. It is time for tea." Ah, a man who believed in tea, and in America of all places. I ran to the tap and washed off, following George and his 2 Irish wolfhounds into the kitchen. He pointed me to a place set with a mug of steaming cocoa and a plate of 2 large bear claws. These were a pastry in the shape of a bear's footprint, the custard center and sprinkled with walnuts. These were George's favorite and were to be the normal fare for tea every day. The only thing that differed was, on a cold day, he would put a shot of rum in the cocoa. My 2 bear claws were inhaled. "You didn't have lunch, did you?" "No," I replied. "Do you drive?" "Yes, George." He smiled at that. "From now on, you take the car, and then you bring me my groceries. As you can see, I have tunnel vision, and I hate going into town. You also get the lettuce trimmings in the back of the supermarket for my swans. Is that all right with you?" "You bet, George." I was already enjoying driving around in his 1965 Impala Chevy. Let's go. "What would you like me to do now?" "Just do what you think needs to be done." I'd never had a boss like that before. The first thing I did was clean the house. It was full of dog hair, and the carpets were muddy from the dogs as well. So I shook the carpets and swept the house. There was no wood near the fireplace, so I split wood and filled the wood box. The garden was completely neglected, so the transplanting had to go on hold, while I mowed the lawn and raked all the leaves off the muddy pathway to the front door. I realized that this man was going to let me run this place as though it were my own, and I decided to give it my best. The next day, I bought George's groceries, got the lettuce trimmings, and also bought a few bags of cement with the money he gave me. I had seen some sand and gravel in his driveway, so decided to do some improvements. When I arrived, George was napping again. I went to the shed and took some long, thin pieces of 4-inch timber and put in shuttering for a sidewalk. I made it wind through the camellia bushes out into his parking area. By the time George awoke, I had poured half of the pathway in concrete, putting in thin strips of wood every few feet to allow for expansion or contraction. I thought to myself, this is where I'm going to get fired if I'm going to be fired. He came out and had a look at what I was doing. He nodded his head and said, "I've been wanting to do that for a long time, Bill. Come, tea time." He turned and I quickly washed and hurried in, looking forward to the bear claws and cocoa. It was there all right, but there was also a full plate of food. I knew I had arrived. When the rains came, the entryway to the back door was a mess. Can I have some money for timber, George? I'll make out the check and leave it blank. You fill in the amount. They know me in Angwin, so it won't be a problem. I was amazed at the fact that he didn't even want to know what I was going to do. Or maybe he did and was just pretending. I went out and found this German carpenter. I had drawn plans for a deck leading to the back door, past the big oak, and had even taken the measurements. I showed them to the carpenter, and together we went to the shop and bought everything. I made the carpenter pay, as I was going to add the labor to the cost of the materials. The next day we arrived and started on the project. George took his chair and put it under a black walnut tree and watched. Every time I looked over at him, he just nodded and smiled. By sundown we had finished the job. I tallied up the hourly rate for the carpenter and added the cost of the timber and filled in the check. George came up and paced back and forth a couple of times. Then he said the words I was waiting to hear. You know, Bill, I've been wanting to do this for a long time. I had worked on a farm for 4 years at Helderberg, so I knew about pruning, fertilizing, harvesting. I looked after all the apples, and when I got bored, I would go down to the dam and fish. On some afternoons, especially when it was sunny, I would sit on the wooden pier and fish all afternoon, catching bluegills. Sometimes George would come and sit down with me, and other times I wouldn't even see him until it was time for tea. I was never questioned about anything, and at the end of the month, he would give me a check, which was always more than enough to take care of school fees. George had several passions. Classical music, especially the piano. I found out that he had given his first piano concert by the time he was 18. Swans. The trumpeter, mute, and the New Zealand black swan were all there on his dam. He would sit on the edge of the dam and break the lettuce into small pieces and feed all of them by hand. They were not in the least frightened of him. I was watching him watering plants the one day with a hose, and a thrush came down, landed on his hand, and had a drink from the hose. On another occasion, I was resting in the pines, and he came out into the apple orchard to find me. A deer was eating a fallen apple, and let George walk right up to it. As soon as I sat up, however, the deer ran away. The only way I can describe it is that he had an aura about him that made everything feel comfortable. His other passion was gambling. I would drive him all the way to Lake Tahoe, and he would spend the night gambling. Roulette was his game, and he always won. Sometimes it was only $500, but usually it was in the thousands. Everyone seemed to know him, and without him telling me, I would keep people away from crowding in on him. I would bring him a drink now and then, or something to eat, as he didn't like to leave the table once he started. Bad luck, you know. He would give me a ticket to go to a show. As soon as I got to the place where the show was, a lady would say, "Are you Bill?" "Yes, madam." "Do you mind if I sit with you?" "No, madam." They were all pretty things and would sit there chatting away. After the show, they would take me and we would have dinner. Then I would go back to George. He would look at me with a twinkle in his eye. I knew that old goat had arranged it. He knew that I liked Dionne Warwick, so he gave me a ticket. Maybe Dionne Warwick. So he gave me a ticket one night to go to one of her shows. The hall was round with a carousel in the middle. The hall was also packed with the men in black. They had on black suits, black shirts, black ties, black hats, and of all things, black sunglasses at night time. They all looked very Italian, but that didn't worry me. They were all standing close to the stage, as Diane had already come out. I quickly got down on my hands and knees and crawled up to the front and stood up. Diane was standing right in front of me and took my hand and pulled me up onto the stage. I saw you the moment you came in. Got down and crawled right up to me. Why are you so red, honey? She asked me my name and where I was from. Then she sang one of the latest hits, the Wedding Bell Blues, which started out, Bill, I love you so, I always will. She had on a light blue silk dress, and it was easy to see that she didn't have on much else. Her hips moved like they had a brain of their own. And here I was, slow dancing with this lady, as she sang one song after another. Between each song, she would talk to me. I must say, I've never met someone like you before, she said at the end of the program. I can also say, I said into the ear, I've never danced with a black woman before. Just one thing I don't understand. You are black, but more white on the inside than I ever will be. She threw back her head and really laughed. I got a big kiss and knew it was time for me to leave. I got a lot of smart remarks from the mafia as I left, and a few cuffs on the shoulder. When I told George what had happened, he just smiled. He had arranged that one too. Driving him back early the next morning, I had so many questions I wanted to ask. Having seen every type of wound possible, I had seen where he had been run through with a sword. On one of his legs were the scars of shrapnel. I knew he was Russian, that George was his real name, but his surname had been changed. He told me that himself. I knew that he used to come by ship to America every year on holiday when he was small. He had a chauffeur that drove a Zia, the Russian version of a Rolls-Royce, was a concert pianist, and his mother was the Queen of Sweden. He had an uncle Peter, and they had to escape from the Bolsheviks in Georgia, Russia. He had had bodyguards for most of his life, and now he was tucked away on a small apple farm in Old Howell Mountain Road. I bit my tongue. What's on your mind, Bill? You could always read my mind. Who are you, George? I've almost forgotten, is all he would ever say. Often my classmates would be curious about my job. I would invite them to come down and have a meal at George's farm, warning him that I was bringing guests to lunch and that I would cook. I would make baked potatoes, tossed salad, and then take a tin of dog food, cut both ends of the tin, slice the dog food, dip it in egg and flour, and fry it. Everyone would comment on what a good cook I was, and George would just sit there smiling, not saying a word. Anne was a lovely young lady who had taken a fancy to me. I was too busy to date, but too much of a gentleman to tell her to get lost. Through past experiences, I also knew that our different backgrounds were bound to get me in trouble. I was learning how to build walls to keep people away from me. She always wanted to come down to the farm, so I took her to lunch one day and gave her the usual. After lunch, I put the plates on the floor, and after the 2 Irish wolfhounds had licked them clean, I put the plates straight back into the cupboard. She didn't seem to fancy me so much after that. George loved to tell his friends about this. He'd also tell them what a waste of money I was. He would fix me up with the ladies up at Lake Tahoe, and all I would do was talk to them. I worked for George for 5 years. His garden became a picture straight out of Home and Garden. I've already forgotten all that I was ever supposed to learn in college, but I'll never forget the colors George put in my rainbow. I was treated like a beloved son, and I like to think that I gave him as much as he gave me. Fitting all the pieces of the puzzle together, I would say that he was probably one of the cousins to Tsar Nicholas. Sure. Imagine my delight when I was offered a job commercial fishing in Alaska. I was told that it was a gamble, because sometimes the fishing was good, and sometimes you hardly made enough to get back to school. I was more interested in the fact that I might make money fishing, and if nature smiled upon us, well and good. Oh, what? This sentence is weird, Leash. I was more interested in the fact that I might make money fishing if nature smiled upon us, well and good. I think that's what he's meaning to say. I always felt that schooling was just marking time until I was able to go back home to Africa. Huh. That's how I feel. I've still got a year and a half left before I can go back home. Maybe I need to go and do some fishing in Alaska. It was the times in between schooling that made the stay in America interesting. And if it was fishing, whether spear fishing, dynamiting, line fishing, gill netting, it was still fishing, and it still gave me the same satisfaction. Our boats were limited to 32 feet in length. The length of the nets were limited to 1,000 feet, and the size of the mesh was 4 inches to allow the smaller salmon to get through. Fishing was a lot like hunting. I would scan the horizon for birds, and when there were no birds, I would search the sea for seals or whales. In rough water, the schools of salmon would be close to the beaches. In calm water, they would be out in the deeper water. The tides were what made fishing dangerous. In 6 hours, the tide would raise as much as 24 feet. That meant that when the tide was going out, you could easily get caught on a sandbar, and then the boat would be dashed to pieces due to the big waves. In that cold water, one only lasted 5 minutes due to hypothermia. In a good storm, an average of 3 fishermen died. You could say that the pay was good due to the danger. It was always a thrill to me when I would throw out the net while the boat was moving, and from the moment it hit the water, the net would start smoking. As the salmon hit the net, they would get their gills caught in the net and then thrash their tails back and forth, causing a fountain of spray about 3 to 4 feet tall. When you saw that net smoking from one end to the other, you could almost hear the money dropping into your bank account. Just gonna get a bit of milk to drink. My goodness, this is a long chapter. Okay. Getting there, nearly at the end. At least it's Friday, huh? Okay. One day, my partner Ernie was fast asleep in his bunk while I was watching the net. I saw all these pieces of paper floating all over the bay, and then one of them rose right next to the boat, opened a valve, and took a breath before disappearing. It took me a second to realize that this was not a piece of paper, but a beluga or white whale. Lots of them. I counted 200 before I gave up counting. The whole lot of them came in through the fishing fleet, and not one of them hit a single net. I was jumping with glee. On 2 occasions we had a killer whale come rocketing up out of the water close to our boat, turn in the air and come crashing down on their side. Then out on the horizon we would see another one do the same. It wasn't long before the 2 of them were together. No doubt it was another way of communication apart from their squeaks and whines. The owner of the boat, Ernie, was a native Alaskan, just like I am a native African. When the fishing periods were closed, we would always be out looking for berries on the tundra or beachcombing. These small excursions grew until we were planning expeditions. Once we flew out to Crooked Island and were dropped off for a week. The plane landed on the beach and we made our camp right near a freshwater stream. Everything we picked up or handled, the foxes, which apparently owned the island, would urinate or park a coil on it. I don't think they approved of us being there. We collected Japanese glass fishing floats, walrus ivory, and a few usiks, the bone that is found in a walrus penis. It is the shape of a club with a proper handle. I, I had always hoped I would have to use one of these in a self-defense, and then when the judge asked what I would, and then when the judge asked what I used to brain the attacker, I would have to tell him that it was a walrus penis. We also dug in an old Eskimo village and found tools made out of mastodon bone, plus many other items of interest. Our next expedition took us out to the islands in the fishing boat. Through the binoculars, we could see that the beach was reddy brown with the bodies of thousands of walrus. We anchored around the corner of the island and went into shore in a rubber duck. From there, we crept up to the sleeping walrus herd. They had come in on the high tide and were now all sunning themselves on the beach. I couldn't help myself. I leapt onto the stomach of the first walrus and skipped, jumped, danced, and ran my way across the herd to the other side. Of course, the noise was deafening with all the roars. They all turned and waddled down to the water, and went from cumbersome beasts to graceful mermaids. Ugly ones, I must admit. Once I had made it across, I looked back, and there was Ernie, riding one of the old boys who was lagging behind. On land, he couldn't turn his body enough to spear Ernie with his long tusks, so he was quite safe. It was one of the occasions in my life that I wish I had had a camera. Another time we went up the 7 Tikchik lakes, all connected by rivers. It was on the second lake that Ernie's dad had crashed his new float plane when Ernie was only 18 months old. His mother had dived down and brought up Ernie, tied him to a pontoon, and then dived down numerous times to try and get her husband out. But exhaustion had taken its toll, and Don died by drowning. It was between the second and third lakes that we met with the grizzlies catching salmon that were going upstream. They were so busy they hardly noticed us. Both Ernie and I worked for the Smith Litteridge Company, who took grub stakes and oil up to the Eskimo villages that were located along the rivers. So our expeditions were all planned to take place between trips. Names like Ugashik, Manakodak, Koligonek, Knakanak, Newstuyahok, Nushigak all became synonymous with adventures in navigation and fishing. At the end of a day, which could be 2 in the morning, as it was light most of the night, we would tie up along the bank of the river and shut down the engines. I would get out my rod and reel and start fishing for supper right away. If I caught anything under 5 pounds, it was considered too small and was thrown back. Sure, 5 pounds being too small. Lovely. Now that is fishing. Rainbow trout were the best, to eat and to catch. We had made it to the village of Koligonek when I decided that I wanted something besides fish for dinner. I went to the bank and started to cut a couple of throwing sticks when I noticed this old Eskimo watching me. When I had finished shaping them with my knife, I invited him to come hunting with me. He obviously didn't speak English, but did understand my motions. We went together out onto the tundra, and it wasn't long before a ptarmigan flew up from a patch of berries. I threw my first stick and then immediately threw the second one. I missed with the first, but the second stick went spinning out towards the rising ptarmigan, and when the two collided, the ptarmigan fell with a broken neck. I tucked the bird in my belt and then walked on with my new accomplice. It wasn't long before another ptarmigan flew up, and this time I got it with my first stick. 2 was enough for a meal, so I took it back to shore and made a fire, roasting the ptarmigan and making a pot of maize porridge. That good old sadza maize porridge. I showed the old man how to eat it with his hands, rolling it into a ball, dipping it lightly in the salt, and then eating it with a piece of meat. The ptarmigan was as tough as an old boot, but it was a change from fish, so I ate it, as did my silent guest. I showed him how to take a piece of food, drop it on the ground, a way of saying thank you to nature, a custom that we were brought up with in Africa. It must have struck a familiar chord with the old man, because he smiled for the first time. When we had finished the meal, I brought him a bucket of water to wash his hands, and then washed my own hands. He then took me by the sleeve and pulled me along with him to a hut. He motioned for me to take off my clothes, and he did the same. Then we went into the hut that was filled with steam and naked men. He started to talk and told the men everything I had done in detail, even down to the washing of the hands. One of the men spoke English and asked me where I was from, and then for the rest of the day he asked the questions and translated my answers. The most questions were about hunting and what the animals looked like. I fished in Alaska for 7 summers and always managed to make enough money to go back to the States and pay my tuition. But better than the money, my mouth is getting tired, but better than the money was the fishing and the friends. I was accepted to Loma Linda University Dental School after I had received my bachelor's in biology at Pacific Union College. It was a bad dream that lasted for 4 years. However, there was one bright spot of daylight. Most students had to learn how to pull teeth in the oral surgery department. I read one day of a program that flew students to far-off places and let them learn how to pull teeth under instruction on primitive people that had never had the chance to see a dentist. I was interested right away. I applied and soon had word that I was accepted to go to Nicaragua. We arrived in the capital city just after the bad earthquake of 1973. The place stank of all the bodies that had been trapped beneath the rubble, and I was glad when the old Army Dakota flew our team out to the jungles in the east side of the country. We landed on a grassy strip with only a corrugated iron shed as a waiting room. No one had brought any water, and the usual Coca-Cola machine was not available. Our hosts had not arrived, and it was a blistering hot day. Already the group was complaining. To the amazement of my classmates, I took my shoes off and climbed up the palm tree. Already the group was complaining. I noticed a coconut tree nearby and took off my shoes. To the amazement of my classmates, I climbed up the palm like a monkey, and when I got hold of the top leaves, I was able to dislodge the green coconuts with my bare feet. I kicked off about 40 of them for the group of 16, and then slid down the tree. I always carry a knife and set to work to take off the tops of the coconuts. I noticed an Indian standing watching me from the shade of the jungle with his bow and arrow, and a long panga, which is machete, hanging at his side. I motioned to him to come close and jab it away to him in Swahili. Now, I know he didn't speak Swahili, but it was not English, he knew that. And so he let me use his panga to lop off the tops of all the coconuts, which I did with a single chop. I showed everyone how to drink the juice, and then how to take a strip of the coconut skin and use it as a spoon to eat the inside. The Indian smiled when he saw me showing the rest of them how to eat a coconut. He was probably thinking, but everyone should know how to eat a coconut from the time they are born. He came with us into town when our hosts arrived and picked us up in their truck. He became my assistant. I was taught how to pull teeth the first day, and by the end of that day I had the knack of it pretty well down pat. For the next 2 weeks, I pulled an average of 300 teeth a day. Wearing only my rugby shorts or a sarong and my mosquito Indian friend as my assistant. By that time, I knew a few words in mosquito, and my friend and I disappeared one day to go into the jungle. We spent the whole day slithering around on our bellies, as the only way of getting around in those thick jungles was to follow the waterways. I was instructed in the art of bird hunting, snake catching, and plant medicine. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but he lectured me all day, and I just nodded. And when he stuck leaves in his mouth, I did the same. When he dug roots, I would help. And by the end of the day, I think I had tasted every kind of bitterness created. Now I had caught pythons before, so when we came across an anaconda, it was a cinch for the two of us. We held it for a while and then let it go, watching it melt into the foliage. If only all learning could have been like this. When I graduated with my doctorate degree in dentistry, the dean of the dental school leant over and whispered in my ear, "I'm not sorry to see you go, Taylor." I didn't even reply. I had my degree in hand. I was going back to the bush of Africa. Sure, that was a long chapter. My goodness. But I think you guys might have to break that up into two listenings because it's 40, more than 45 minutes. All right, well, I need to hit the sake. I'm buggered, absolutely buggered. Anyway, sleep well, and I'll see you tomorrow.